All right, hello everybody. Okay, so today we will get into some Aristotle, right? And so our big goal for the next couple of lectures is to look at Aristotle's response to Parmenides. So recall that Parmenides thinks that there is no problem or solves the problem of change by identifying that there is no change. Everything that exists is all part of one kind of being, right? One being, right? So when it looks like things change, right? Maybe I lift my coffee cup or put my arm above my head, right? Um, that looks like I'm changing or the coffee cup is changing, but in reality, there is no change because there is no distinction between me, the coffee cup, the space between me and the coffee cup, right? That's all just being. So Parmenides wants to say, look, there is no such thing as any of us or any distinct objects. Rather, there's just one object, being, to which all of the things that look like they're distinct are part of. Okay, so Aristotle is going to offer a response to this. But before we look at his response, we need to go over the difference between equivocal and univocal naming. So, um, so we talk about these concepts, even though they look a little intimidating, are relatively mundane. So when we talk about equivocal naming and univocal naming, we're talking about using the same name, right, to refer to very different objects, right? So first, um, okay, what's the definition of an equivocal of an equivocation? So suppose we have two things. Let's say the place where you put your money, right? And the place that's like on the side of a river. Okay, let's suppose we have those two things. Those two things are given one and the same name, right? We'll say bank, where bank has one meaning when predicated of X and a different meaning when predicated of Y, right? So when we talk about being predicated, that just means that it's like we're labeling that object. So here we have two different senses of the word bank. We have the bank of a river, and then we have the bank where we put our money, right? So the word bank is being used to refer to two really different kinds of objects, right? And so, like, if we lack context clues, it seems like we might think we might get like confused, right? Maybe I tell you, hey, I went to the bank today, and you're like, "Oh, how much money did you put in the bank?" "Oh, no, I went fishing," right? Because I was on the side of the river, right? The riverbank. And so we can get confused because we are using our terms kind of imprecisely. Okay, so univocal naming is when two things are given one and the same name, where in has precisely the same meaning when predicated of X and Y, right? So imagine that we're talking about two banks, right? But we're talking about two banks uh, two places where you put your money, right? And so if I say, oh, I went to one bank and then I went to the next bank, that would not be equivocal because we're talking about two different objects that are of the same kind, right? Um, so we can have univocal naming and we can have equivocal naming. Okay, so here's a couple of examples of equivocal naming and univocal naming. So for example, John's bank, where he saves his money, is 2 miles from his house. There's a bank in the building across the street from my apartment. That's where I save my money, right? So here we're using the term bank in the same sense, right? We're talking about two different places where you put your money, right? And then in the second one, we're saying the bank where Joan keeps her money is 6 blocks from the bank of the Kentucky River, right? So we might say that we're using bank in two different senses or an equivocal sense in the second example. Okay, all right, so we've drawn out a distinction so far between univocal naming and equivocal naming. Now let's draw out a second distinction between completely different equivocal naming and similar or related equivocal naming on the other hand. Okay, so suppose we have two objects once again, where and we use one and the same name for both objects. But let's imagine that the name has a completely different meaning when it's predicated of one object or when it's labeling one object, and then when it's predicating or labeling some other object. So this is an example of like our bank example, right? So um, when I use the term bank to refer to a river, and I use the term bank to refer to um, uh, a place where I put my money, right? I'm talking about two completely different things, right? Like the meaning of those two words is not related at all, right? Um, okay, so we would say that this is an example of completely equivocal naming, right? And then we might talk about similar or related equivocal naming. So this is when you have the same term to refer to two different objects, right? But they're kind of like in a similar or related way. So, for example, let's go to the next slide. Okay, um, so I tell you, when I hear that dog bark, it makes me want to run outside and scrape the bark off a tree. Okay, so here, kind of like the bank example, we have the same word bark referring to two different kinds of objects, right? Namely, the noise a dog makes versus the stuff that's on a tree, right? And so this would be an example of completely different equivocal naming. Okay. And then I think 2 and 3 are examples of, like, similar but, like, related, equivocal naming. So, how do you know that John is healthy? Well, he eats healthy food, right? So, um, John is healthy in the sense that, like, his body is functioning well, right? But food that's healthy is not like the food's body is functioning well. Rather, the food being healthy helps helps John's body function well, right? So this is like we're using the same term to refer to two different kinds of healthiness, right? And then in the latter sense, or in the last one here, the wine that Jane brought to the party was very good. She's such a good person, right? We might say that, okay, this is an example of similar or related to equivocal naming, right? Because the we could talk about good wine and a good person. And they're similar, right? They're like maybe goodness is like beneficial in some way. But when we say that a wine is good and we say that a person is good, we are talking about different things. So this would be an example of a similar or related to equivocal naming. Okay, so we talked about univocal naming and equivocal naming, and then we made a second distinction between completely different equivocal naming and similar but related to univocal naming. Okay, with that distinction in mind, we're going to move into how Aristotle responds to Parmenides' account of being. Okay, and we're going to see that the point here is to show that Parmenides is equivocating about the term being. So anyway, stay tuned. We're gonna do some more philosophy very soon.